Let's talk ACC football. This is ACC Nation. I'm Jim Quist. That's Will Ogenin. And there's a lot of big sports news to talk about. We'll start with the publisher of the rival site, Jackets Online, Kelly Quinlan, who can fill us in on the departure of not only head football coach Jeff Collins, but also the athletic director, Todd Stansbury. Thanks for joining us, Kelly. Tell us, just lay it all out. We've got a big plate here, and it needs to be filled.
Sure. So basically, at the end of last season, Todd Stansbury kind of stood behind Jeff Collins. He said they're showing progress. They were close to winning several more games, and they had improved in some of the areas that people were angry about. The kicking was a little bit better, but ultimately, you get into the season. They lost a game at UCF that they probably had a 75% chance to win. They're in the red zone 5 times, got 0 points, missed 2 field goals and had another punt block, the 4th of the season, which is at least modern school record in my lifetime. I went back as far as I could when the 3rd one got blocked, and I got to as far as the stats went back, which was like 83. And they had 2 seasons between 1983 and this season where they had 2 punts blocked, and that was it. And it's like 1 or none, right? And that really wasn't an issue during Collins' tenure prior to really last year with his new punter, who's a kid from Ireland, and they had protection issues and all kinds of stuff. So people were just kind of fed up. He needed to win a couple games, I think, early in the season, upset somebody. They got shut out by Ole Miss, who's gave up 27 to Tulsa, I think, this week. It's not working. And it became painfully obvious. Todd Stansbury tied himself to Jeff, and by keeping him when people wanted him fired. And that's the thing. Like, there were a lot of boosters who were ready to move on. They were vocally talking in the paper about, it's time to make a change. One of the guys was pretty adamant that he didn't necessarily believe in Todd Stansbury anymore as AD. So there's been this growing sort of anger towards Todd. Todd gave Jeff a 7-year, 100% guaranteed contract too. So they're on the hook for a lot of money. I mean, they did everything you can do wrong to set this guy up for success. There was no oversight over Jeff when Jeff was right, as the famous quote, writing checks your body can't catch from Top Gun or whatever. Like, there's all this stuff. Jeff was shot out of a cannon. He was excited, and he said too much. He oversold and is underdelivered. And so this is the culmination of all that. And eventually the hens come home to roost. And that led to 2 guys getting fired today. I'd heard in the background that definitely Stansbury was on the hot seat, and Jeff had to, go to a bowl game or something this year to save himself. But it became painfully obvious that it's not working. The fundamentals of the program are flawed with just, basic things like punt protection, how you use your timeouts in a game, strategy things that made no sense. So, Brent Key takes over as the interim head coach, following in the footsteps of his mentor, George O'Leary, who took over for Bill Lewis in 1995. Yeah, I think that's right. When Bill Lewis got fired midseason and a dreadful season that year. They won 1 game that season. And Brent will have, this 7-game, 8-game audition here, and we'll see where things lie, but I expect them to go outside to hire a head coach, and they got to hire an AD now too. And that's super complicated to do both, within the window of probably trying to have this wrapped up by the first week of December.
That's really pushing it, unless somebody's got some inside track going on there. I need to say this because on an earlier podcast, and it may have been with you, and I think it may have been, it's time for me to eat a little crow. So one of you guys passed me the barbecue sauce here. I said I thought Collins was locked in for the year because of business, aspect. Obviously, wiser heads than I are steering the ship at Georgia Tech, so that's a good thing. We'll get into who possibly, and you had written about this, about who possibly could be filling some of these roles. We'll talk about that in just a moment or two. Will?
So, full disclosure, I've been at work all day, so I have not had an opportunity to read a lot. So, why? So, I guess the first question I want to ask is why now?
So they're in the middle of a road trip. They're going to come back. The last home game was pretty ugly. There were fans calling for Jeff's head, for Todd's head. At the end of the Georgia game, there were fans. There was one fan I remember very specifically, and he was very polite about it. He goes, "Mr. Stansberry, why did you do this to us?" Referring to hiring Jeff Collins. And the fan bases have just checked out. The season ticket sales are the lowest they've been in a really long time. Um, the attendance was sort of lukewarm for an Ole Miss game that should have been a packed house. Even in the Benz, it wasn't probably what it should have been. And they even against Western Carolina, they weren't great. They played well in the second half. They started really slow. In the last the last four P5 games, they've been outscored 183 to 10.
Yeah.
Now, granted, they're playing a top 10 Notre Dame team. They played a the team that won the national championship in the second one of those games. They played Clemson in the opener. The Ole Miss one is the one that gets me because even people I know who are Ole Miss fans will tell you they're an okay team. They're probably like 8-9 wins max out at Ole Miss, probably in the top 25 at the end of the year, but that's the SEC bump, probably not really a top 25 team. That's a big part of it, finances, and then, Stansberry had issues before. He refused to pay his Oregon State buyout. There was a lawsuit that was very ugly. A bunch of Georgia Tech people came to his rescue because he was an alum, quite frankly. I think if he had not been a Georgia Tech alum and not had history here working for many years, they probably wouldn't have helped him. And so, this all kind of lies on him. He went lone wolf during the search and even talked about it when he hired Jeff, that he kind of was marching to his own drum and really didn't talk to anyone on the outside, including the people that probably could have warned him about some of Jeff's, more concerning qualities, people that worked with him before. That he was just, Jeff's a guy that was constantly on the move upward. And there was concern from people I know that had worked from him in the past that it was going to end up not going well if he wasn't. You can work with him, but you needed to surround him with a really good staff. And you also needed to provide oversight, right? Like give him mentorship, help him, because there was some immaturity things, and we're all guilty of that. We get excited about something, and he oversold, man, and he should have used the word. He talked about rebuilding, but he didn't. He's talking about being in the top 25 and stuff too. He wasn't like, this is a 5-year process. That's what Josh Pastner did, right? Rightly or wrongly. And basketball is even easier to turn around. And Josh was like, look, this is a process. It's going to take us several years. And the AD at that time, Mike Babinski's at Purdue now, was very clear in his introductory thing. Like, we're rebuilding this from scratch. It's going to take time. Didn't do that at all with Jeff. And then they dunked on sort of marginal recruiting wins. They had a good 2020 class, but then things kind of fell off as the portal became more important. And so, they're coming up with their own recruiting rankings before anyone had actually figured out how to formulate like a transfer ranking and all of that stuff, and being like, oh, we signed this class, but it wasn't actually calculated against what other people took in the portal. There was all sorts of nonsense that went on in noise. And Georgia Tech people are pragmatic. They just kind of were like, this seems ridiculous. And eventually, caught up with them. There was a lot of excitement. But at the end of the day, the most unified I've seen this fan base, and that, been covering them since 2009 and been in the market seeing it, covering Georgia before that, is that they all wanted Jeff Collins gone. And most of them wanted Todd Stansberry gone too, that were following it closely. So this is the end result of that.
So as far as the AD search goes, I gotta imagine this is going to be figured out pretty quickly, right?
So this was not an unexpected result. I'll put it that way. Like, I don't want to burn sources and stuff on things, but I had heard that he was in a lot of trouble if this didn't go well. And it was something I hinted at and got a lot of pushback from people at Tech. But the reality was, I knew people that knew kind of what was going on behind the scenes. I know a lot of the major players, and they were telling me like, this is they're doing the opposite of what Todd Stansberry did. Todd Stansberry didn't really have a plan for Paul Johnson retiring. Like, even though Paul talked about it openly to everyone that was in the building for like 2 or 3 years before he did it, it kind of caught him flat-footed. He tried to convince Paul Johnson to stay for another year. Paul said no, and then they were dumped into this sort of search that, they hit like 3 or 4 people right off the bat. 2 of them were really long shots. One of them was Bill O'Brien, who was in the playoffs with the Texans at that point, or taking them to the playoffs. And then Ken Wisenhut, a kind of mediocre, a more mediocre version of Chan Gailey. Like, so that was my concern when the search started going for Jeff Collins, that was going that direction. I like the idea of what Jeff was bringing, but at the end of the day, it just didn't work. There's a billion reasons why, I'm sure, but so now, the AD thing, I think, is moving ahead. They hired a search firm. How much the search firms are involved really depends on each school. People get all up in arms about that, but they have to facilitate the meetings. They do a lot of the back channel stuff for you to see if people are interested in those kind of things. And they'll present you some options, and you can choose to take them or leave them. I know that the president of the school is very adamant about wanting to fix things. From everyone I've talked to who's close to him. So it became sort of an embarrassing thing, right? You play in your home stadium, and you're playing a road game. The last 2, major sort of major home games, which was the Clemson game in the Benz and Ole Miss, the stadium was, significantly the other color. The Georgia game, they took over the entire stadium. So I think that something had to give here, and Todd's the guy. And now, the search goes on, but I just don't know. 80 searches are very hard to predict, right? Unless you're at a school where their boosters are very much in control. It's even in places like that. Look at what happened at Auburn, right? Like, they hired kind of an out of the box AD, and he's already been fired. So you just never know what's going to happen.
So before we get into the names, I just want to understand. You mentioned the interim coach, Brent Key. So he is an alum. So what for people outside the program? What can you tell us about him?
Brent's a tough guy. He loves Georgia Tech. He played offensive line at Georgia Tech. He coached there. He GA'd there. He worked for O'Leary. And then he left Alabama to come back to Georgia Tech. He was, an assistant on Nick Saban's staff, and wanted to come and help, Jeff Collins, with this rebranding, retooling, whatever you want to call it, of the team. And he's a diehard Georgia Tech fan. He was like, I talked to one of the parents after on Saturday night, and they told me he was crying like after the UCF game. He had coached there for a long time, and he was really upset that they had lost that game. He cares about it. Whether he'll be a good head coach, I have no idea. He struggled as an offensive coordinator, but that's a different animal too. He was offensive coordinator at O'Leary's last year at UCF, and the wheels came off that bus there pretty hard. But Brent's a guy that cares a lot about Georgia Tech. He has a lot of respect from people in the program. The one thing that Tech fans are bristling about a little bit is his group has been probably the worst of the offensive guys. The offensive line just hasn't played well the whole time they've been here. But to me, that was also the biggest transition piece, because you were going from smaller triple option offensive linemen that are quicker to something more big and physical. And the former OC Dave Padnode, I think, had strange ideas of what he was doing there. And they've had a lot of mishaps with guys getting injured, medicals, and all kinds of other stuff. So it's been a long, sort of drawn out rebuild there. That's was always going to be the toughest piece of it.
Now, there's a couple of reasons why this may be. Maybe because it's been a long day, but I also know that you're very interested in the school and how they do. But I can just tell it's had an impact on you. I can just tell by your demeanor, and it almost feels like, that positive, upbeat guy that we normally see on the program has just had the energy sucked out of him today. And I'm sure the fans are like the same way. It's an adjustment, but it will get better. One of the things that you said about Jeff Collins that struck me, and a lot of people have never read this book, but I encourage you to read it. Go find it. It's called The Peter Principle. And it's about how people get promoted to their level of incompetence. And it strikes me that this may have been the case with Collins in this particular venue. Now, a question for you before we get into who, what, and possibly when. Do you believe that this scenario puts Josh Pastner on a hot seat with whoever may be coming in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, they're what are they, a year removed from an ACC championship. They have a pretty good team expected for this season. It's actually Josh's birthday today. So
Happy birthday.
that's funny. Yeah. I don't know. I think it depends on the hire. It depends on a lot of stuff. Pastner's situation is so much different because with Jeff Collins, you're talking $7 to $10 million to get rid of him. With Josh, it's nothing like that.
Right.
The thing with Josh is the thing that's so different about Jeff. Jeff is a guy that's he's like, someone you would have a conversation with in an elevator or something. I don't know how to describe it that way. There's not a lot of deep, meaningful. The few times I think when like my dad died during one of the football weekends, he kind of pulled me aside, we had a nice talk, but there wasn't a lot of that. Like Paul Johnson, I could be on the phone with for half an hour. Josh had many long talks with, Josh comes across as really genuine, and tech people like that about him. And that's given him a longer leash and allowed him to survive some things that might have, taken away other people. He's done mostly the right thing at every turn. And so that's bought him some goodwill. And they've had, 2 really good seasons. They got really messed up in the year they won the ACC championship because they got a terrible draw in the tournament. And then Moses Wright, their best player, got flagged for COVID and missed the tournament. And they lost in the first round. That was a team that maybe could have been a Sweet 16 team. We've all seen what Jose Alvarado is doing with the Pelicans. Like, that was a really talented team, and that was the best Georgia Tech team I've seen in a really long time here. And so, Josh needs to make sure he can keep his guys healthy and win his non-conference games, and I think he'll be okay. But to me, if I'm an AD, that's not the next battle I'm fighting. I think there's too much other stuff like on the table right now. And even, unless he just has a terrible season, I think you punt that ball and worry about the later and hope that he takes care of business and try to focus on getting your new football coach up and running and get him to be as successful as you can. Plus, the baseball coach is getting up there, Danny Hall. And I he got a little bit of a pass from Stansbury. They've underachieved quite a bit too, especially relative to, how that program has been and how they recruit. So, there's a lot of things for a new AD to look at, but I think the focus I would say in the next calendar year is going to be really hard on football.
We'll just look at it from this perspective. This is a good thing. It needed to happen. And I think looking forward, it's a positive thing. Georgia Tech's got a great tradition in sports. And it's time for that to return. So let's talk about some of the people that you possibly believe would be stepping into maybe the AD role, who's out there, and possibly football coaches as well. Who do you think might fill either one of those roles or both?
Really, the AD one's the hardest one. The one name that comes up a lot, and the name that I've heard is actually the Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Jeff Duncan, who's a tech graduate, who's stepping away from politics when his term's over in January. I guess it's January after the election, and kind of taking a break. He doesn't enjoy, I think, what politics are in the 2020s here, or even in the late 2010s. So he's taking a break from the game. Yeah. So he's a guy whose name I've been mentioned. The AD thing's interesting because obviously President Cabrera will have a huge say in that and want to find someone he's comfortable working with, man, woman, whatever. Like, I think that it's a pretty wide open slate overall, but if I were to handicap a favorite, that would be the favorite there. In terms of the football staff, that's a little bit different. Who do they hire as a coach? So there's multiple, different groups pushing different people. The fans are very enthralled with the idea of Deion Sanders, and then there's some that absolutely hate that idea. Would Deion have interest? Yeah. Do I think he can coach at that level right now? I have no idea. My argument against Deion, the one argument I would make is seeing the coaching piece of it. They're more talented than the other teams they play. Like, they have elite talent at that level.
Sure.
You're not going to have elite talent at Georgia Tech compared to Georgia or Clemson or a lot of the other, you will have comparable to maybe the rest of the Coastal, but how does he coach at that level when the playing field's so much more level? How much NIL money are they going to raise for someone like that? And what kind of staff would he put together? Those are the things that I would want to see. I don't know about it. I'm not watching Jackson State football. I can't tell you about his coaching acumen, other than they lost to South Carolina State last year in a pretty big upset in their championship game. The one that's popular with people in the recruiting circles is Del McGee, who's the running backs coach at Georgia. I like Del McGee. Seems like a nice guy. I've met him once or twice. I just don't know. That's where you gamble at this point. I think you got to either take a coordinator or a head coach, and find somebody that has some experience. Yeah, of the guys that I like, Jamie Chadwell at Coastal, that would have actually made more sense going out of Paul, because it's a sort of variation on Paul Johnson's offense in the gun. But he's a guy that's won. Like, he's won everywhere he's been, very consistent, builds his own program. What would he do with better tools and better resources at a place like Georgia Tech? That's certainly interesting to me. I've heard people float Mike Houston from East Carolina. I just haven't seen enough there to make me think that that's the move there. They're really struggling, but he took over a very horrible program at East Carolina that Scotty Montgomery ran into a ditch. So it's hard to tell where he's at that. He's a guy who's also won everywhere he's been too. Had a really good run at James Madison and some other places. Aside from those guys, I think then you're diving into, to me, the guy I make say no right now is Dave Clawson at Wake Forest. And I don't think Dave would take it now, but that's the blueprint of what you need to do at a place like Georgia Tech. And the ceiling's higher at Georgia Tech, in my opinion, than Wake Forest. There's more support. You could raise more money there, I think. And, you have better recruiting grounds. You're not going again. You have a bigger area to recruit than just, taking Carolina leftovers and trying to fight NC State and Carolina Duke for kids. There's a whole huge area you can recruit at Georgia Tech, and the school's much more palatable for a larger group of people. My ex-wife went to Wake Forest. I know all about what that school's like. It's very small and very insular, and I think he's a guy who would do really well. And he's someone they should have interviewed last time. He would have been interested, from what I've know from people that are close to Dave. At that point, he was a little frustrated with what was going on at Wake, because before he quite had them really rolling. But 6 bowl trips at Wake Forest certainly gets my attention. The guy I thought they should have also looked at when Paul left was Willie Fritz at Tulane. He took over for Jeff Monken at Georgia Southern and won big there. Tulane is one of the worst jobs in the country. They have no resources, no money, no facilities. Like, their practice field's tiny. They have to practice in the stadium a lot of the time. Like, they just have nothing there. It's both in football and men's basketball, it's kind of sad, like how kind of jacked up Tulane's situation is for a school with money for their athletic programs. And once a team that was an SEC school, 70 years ago, like, that's the other funny thing about Tulane, much like Georgia Tech. But, I can't imagine he gets interviewed this time. I think people would bristle too much at that. Trying to think if there's anyone else that it kind of really, people will talk about Dan Mullen. I wonder about a guy who failed at Florida, where you have everything. And Mississippi State was such a unique job, and he did really good job there, where you're not under a microscope and there's not a lot of pressure. And he built it and was very consistent winning there. And you could take someone that can fog glass into school, and you can't do that at Georgia Tech. So, and I saw a lot of things that I took issue with his coaching at Florida too. So, he's not far away. He's just outside of Athens right now, kind of living his life and doing some TV and stuff. But, Dan Mullen, to me, what is his desire level to go and rebuild this thing? Why did he take time off? Like, those would all be the questions I would look at there too. And the money piece too with Mullen, I think he would command a lot of money.
Another big story in ACC football is the start of Syracuse football at 4-0 and playing Wagner next before an open date. What's changed? And with a tough back schedule ahead, we wanted to get some thoughts on the team from News Channel 9 Sports Director Steve Infante. Thanks for joining us, Steve.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to do it.
Tell us a little bit about what's happening. What's different this year with the Orange, and why are they at 4-0 and everyone is excited about this team?
Well, you say what's different. I mean, how long do we have here? There's a lot different from last year to this year. And I think it starts with the fact that they're winning close games. I mean, they went through that stretch last year. You look at the 5-7 records, say, oh, it was a bad year. There are a couple plays from certainly being bowl eligible. And, last year they could have won 7 or 8 games. It didn't happen for them. They lost 3 in a row, all by 3 points at the beginning to the middle part of their schedule. And they just couldn't, get over the hump and win that one extra game that would have gotten them, into the postseason. And I think the narrative on last year would have been a lot different if they had just picked up, that one more win and they just couldn't get it done. This year, they come back and Garrett Schrader looks like a completely different quarterback. He had a lot of trouble moving the ball through the air towards the end of last year. I think there's some reasons for that. I think they had injuries along the offensive line. I think Schrader was a little bit more banged up than he led on to. And Dino Babers has alluded to that at the beginning of the season, that, his arm really wasn't in shape to throw the ball as much as they needed him to last year. And I think some of that was the punishment that he took throughout getting some of the bounces and the good breaks this year that they didn't get last year. I mean, you look at the Purdue game and Purdue takes the lead with 51 seconds. Touchdown on the last play of the game, or with 7 seconds left. Well, that's set up by the fact that Purdue committed 2 unsportsmanlike conduct penalties on the extra point, and they kick off from their own 10-yard line. And so now, instead of a touchback, SU gets the ball at the 50, and it makes it a lot more reasonable. I mean, that's nothing SU did other than, they didn't give in to the temptation to get into a back and forth. They took advantage of the good field position. They scored a touchdown. They won the game. Virginia, there was a big face mask on their last drive that set up the game-winning field goal. Again, they took advantage. They're winning close games. This team could be 2-2 right now. Instead, they're 4-0. They're ranked 25th in the coaches poll, and everybody's feeling good around here.
That's what it's all about, man. Will?
So one of the things that when you look at Syracuse football, you think Sean Tucker is as one of the top backs in the country, but he has struggled a little bit. He's only averaging 3.6 yards per carry this season. Is this a case of teams kind of stacking the box a little bit against him?
I don't think there's any doubt about it, Will. Everybody is game planning for him, and they're daring Garrett Schrader to beat him. And, certainly Sean Tucker was held in check. Listen, at conferences, they planned to stop the run, and they did. But if you look at a couple of the touchdowns in that game, Syracuse scores on a pass from Schrader to Isaiah Jones. Sean Tucker was the decoy. They faked it to Tucker. Jones got open, and he passes it to him. On the 4th and 1, that was one of the very key plays in that game. 4th and 1, midway through the fourth quarter, they go for it right around midfield. Again, play action to Tucker. Gatson gets open. He throws it to Gatson. He takes it 46 yards for a touchdown. So even when he's, not getting the ball, just the fact that he's on the field and he's a threat, that is helping this team. So I don't think there's any question, Will, that everybody's stacking the box against him and they're saying, all right, we're not going to let this guy beat us. Somebody else has to. And that's where things are different. Jim asked the question, how are things different this year? One of the ways it's different is that last year they did not have the ability to move the ball through the air with the same success rate that they are this year. So Schrader has gotten better in all facets of his game. The offensive line has gotten better. But they do have to figure out the running game. I mean, things get tougher. I mean, they're going to play NC State, Clemson, Notre Dame all in a row. they have to figure out how to have some semblance of a running game. But the fact that Tucker's on the field and they can use him as a decoy, it's been good enough to this point, but it does have to get better.
For sure. And you mentioned Schrader. I think he has played a lot better this year. And I feel like some of that's the development of Jason Beck as a quarterback. What do you see as his biggest improvement from last year to this year?
I think the coaches will tell you, going through his progressions, that, I think last year sometimes, he would get happy feet, and maybe if his first option wasn't there or his second option wasn't there, Schrader's so good with his legs. He wants to run. He wants to make a play. He's a competitor. He wants to make a play. And so I think that, it's sometimes last year that was an issue for him. This year, I think he's gotten better with his progressions. Going back to that Gadsden touchdown pass against Purdue on the 4th and 1, he was the third option on that play. And he quickly went through his reads, got it to him, and Gadsden, took it to the end zone. So I think that's certainly one of the areas he's improved in. I think his arm strength has gotten better. Remember, he was moved to wide receiver at Mississippi State. So when he came here, he wasn't used to throwing the ball, as much as Syracuse needs him to throw the ball and as much as you need to throw the ball as a starting quarterback in the ACC. And so I think it took him a whole offseason to kind of get up to speed with that. And he went through last year. He knew what to expect. He knew what would be asked of him. And so I think he got himself ready. I think Jason Beck and Robert Anai have really helped him and the guidance they've provided. And also, let's be honest, the offensive line's a big deal. And in 2018, when this program won 10 games, they had the same offensive line essentially for the whole season, healthy. They all started. And the last few years, that has not been the case. They've had a lot of injuries this year so far, knock on wood. SU's had to deal with some injuries, but not at the O-line. For the most part, the O-line has stayed steady and healthy, and it's a veteran group. They've got, in terms of career starts under their belt, and in terms of, games played, they're top 10 in the country across the board in terms of a veteran offensive line. Everybody on the O-line, for the most part, is fourth and fifth year guys. They do have one sophomore on that O-line, but that's made a big difference as well. So I think there's a lot of reasons, Will, why Schrader has looked like a different quarterback.
Penalties have been a big issue for this team. I think they're the most penalized team in the country. How fixable is something like that right now?
Oh, that's a $1 million question. They had a lot of penalties. They had 18 penalties in the first game against Louisville, and then against UConn, everybody was like, "Oh, things are fixed." They had 3 penalties against UConn, but it was just UConn. And now we've seen, obviously the last couple of weeks, those penalties creep up into the double digits again. I think the procedural stuff is fixable. I don't really necessarily think it's a discipline type thing. I think that, they have had a lot of injuries. And so they've got guys on the field that are kind of learning on the job, not so much of the offensive line. As we talked about, they've been healthy, but they've already lost 4 guys to season ending injuries. The defense against Virginia at times was playing without 5 starters on the field at any given time during that game. So I think some of that inexperience maybe is leading into some penalties as well. And you hope that stuff gets cleaned up as you move along, but it's a little bit of a head scratcher how they've committed so many penalties. But, Dino Babers was asked about it today, and he said, hey, Virginia had 12 penalties as well. That crew, they call games a certain way, and he felt like that officiating crew called it the way that they've been calling it, and it was pretty even. Both teams had 12 penalties, but you're right, Will, that's too many. They know they got to cut down on it, and we'll see how they do in that area moving forward.
So, Steve, you hit on the offensive line. It's an area of interest to me because I've noticed that it's made a significant difference in Schrader's time in having a pocket and making things happen. On the other side of that, and you're talking about that defense, still a little green, but I tell you what, I've been impressed by the performance this season of that defense. It seems to continue to make steps season after season. Talk to us a little bit about that line and what makes that defense special and perform up to snuff to hold opponents in check.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jim. And I tell you, that was probably the biggest question mark other than, Schrader's arm coming into the season. The biggest question mark was, what's this D line going to look like? I mean, they lost their top 6 performers on the defensive line for various reasons are not here this year. And it was a young group, an unproven group. And for the most part, they've done a really good job up front. And now they've got a really good core of linebackers. They did lose Stephon Thompson to a season-ending injury in the first game. And you've got a defensive backfield that I think's got some NFL talent in there. I mean, Garrett Williams is going to play on Sundays. I wouldn't be surprised if Deuce Chestnut is playing on Sundays. So the big question was up front, are these guys going to be able to hold their own? And so far the answer has been yes. Now, they did lose Terry Lockett, one of their starting defensive linemen, to a knee injury. And Dino Baber said today it is a season-ending knee injury. We assume it's an ACL. He didn't confirm that, but it looked like an ACL on Friday against Virginia. So that's one missing piece now. You're going to take him out of the equation. Again, everybody's got to continue, next man up mentality. But the defense has been really good. And I tell you what, gentlemen, they've gotten back to forcing turnovers. I mean, from 2018, 2019, 2020, I mean, they were among the top 10, top 20 in the country in forcing turnovers. Last year, they forced 7 turnovers for the whole season. They're already at 8. So in 4 games, they've already surpassed their total from last year. So again, the defensive backfield's really good, and they're coming up with interceptions and forcing fumbles. And the D-line to this point has been able to hold its own.
I just, for disclosure purposes, Steve referred to us as gentlemen. I'll have you know that the check was sent in the mail to you. Let's talk about the back end of the schedule before we wrap up here. As you alluded to earlier, NC State, Clemson, Notre Dame, Pitt, Florida State, Wake Forest, Boston College. This is murderer's row. This is where it's really going to get tough. What does Syracuse need to do specifically on both sides of the ball to be prepared with that open date to really get things focused so that they can take it to each one of these teams and challenge them?
There's no doubt, Jim, it is a daunting task. And, when we looked at the schedule going into the season, the goal was very public, 6-6 at the very least to get to a bowl game. They've been to one bowl game since Dino's been there. Dino took over in 2016. They went to that, the one Camping World Bowl in 2018. They had a 10-win season. Eric Dungy. It was a great year. Other than that, though, it's just been that one appearance. So the goal was 6-6. And we said, hey, if they're going to get to a bowl game, they got to at least start 4-1. They've done that. They're going to be 5-0 after they beat Wagner, and then they just need one down the stretch. So it's a great question. I think, they won't tell you this, but I mean, we kind of look at it as they almost have 2 bye weeks, right? Because they've got Wagner, then they've got the week off. Wagner hasn't won a game since 2019. It's not going to happen this week. And so I think they got to get in. I think they, you say, what do they need to do? I think they got to get back to the basics and figure something out with the running game against Wagner. And again, not that if you're able to run all over Wagner, is that necessarily going to mean you're going to run over NC State and Clemson? No, but I think they got to get some confidence back with the running game. I think you get some of the younger guys in who haven't played a whole heck of a lot yet and use this as an experience game for them, because with the injuries, they might have to play a big role. So I think you want to get them some experience, and I think you want to get your job done and get the starters off the field as quickly as possible so that you can start, going into the healing everybody up, and you want to be, as at full capacity as you can be going into that stretch of NC State, Clemson, and so on and so forth. And this, a couple injuries have seemed to derail them. I mean, you look at Dino's record in November, it is not good. And I think a big reason for that is A, the schedules have been backloaded to some degree, and B, they just don't have the depth when the injuries pile up. The twos aren't as good as the ones. If you're at Clemson, you might have a backup who's just as good or nearly as good as the starter. It's not the case at Syracuse. But I think it's getting better. I think the depth is getting better. So, is this team ready to compete against NC State, Clemson, Notre Dame? It happens, but I think the fact they've got a bye week built in after Wagner, I think that it gives them the best chance at success. That NC State game is at home. It should be a great environment, and you hope that the home crowd and the home field can kind of do its thing, and maybe they get a bounce here or there. But it's a daunting task. NC State's really good. Clemson's really good. That whole back half of the schedule is daunting, and the BC game is last. I mean, there could be a scenario where this team loses 6 games in a row, and then they got to beat BC to go to a bowl game. That could happen. So we'll see how it plays out. But I tell you what, fans up here are definitely excited with this 4-0, soon to be 5-0 start. They haven't been 5-0, by the way, since 1987. that year they went unbeaten and they went to the Sugar Bowl. So I'm not saying it's going to happen this year, but there is some excitement certainly up here about this team.
Steve putting some mojo on the team there, man. I'll tell you, that sounds good. Hey, we appreciate you stopping by and talking to us a little bit about the success of Syracuse. News Channel 9 sports director Steve Infante. And Steve, always a pleasure to have you on. And, you know, man, you set a standard for us. We got to start dressing up more.
I just got off the air. I
feel a little inferior here.
How do you think I feel?
Always a pleasure, you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Steve.
Talk to you, Steve. So some good information there from Kelly Quinlan at the top, talking about Georgia Tech and what's transpired. And also Steve Infante out of Syracuse talking about the success of the Orange, of the Qs, and how they've been going and what they are looking at record-wise. Could turn out to be a bowl year for those guys, and that's pretty exciting. Speaking of excitement, you and I were just talking a moment ago before we started this segment about the weather and how that could come into play with some of the weekend's games. So we're not 100% sure that some of these games are going to be played. They may be moved to another date. We'll keep you up on that. But we're going to look at two games on the schedule. I'm going to run down real quickly, Will, the games that are on the schedule. Louisville takes on Boston College. Wagner is at Syracuse. UVA is at Duke. Virginia Tech takes on UNC. Georgia Tech at Pitt, and Notre Dame has an open week. But there's two games on this list that we felt were very important to take a look at because of the success of the team so far and how this may play into how the ACC ends up with the championship game. Wake Forest takes on FSU. Well, this is a big question mark, but because of the weather. But let's say it gets played. What are your thoughts?
So yeah, like it's really hard to really fully break this game down, not knowing what the impact of Hurricane Ian is going to have on this game. But assuming this gets played, yeah, this should be, you know, a fun game. You got Wake, who proved they are one of the best, you know, they're a top 25 team undoubtedly with that performance against Clemson, even though it was in a losing effort. They proved they belonged. They exploited Clemson's secondary, which is secretly not very good. I mean, Sam Hartman pretty much did whatever he wanted to do against them, and now he's taking on Florida State. Florida State's probably one of the biggest surprise teams in the country, I would say, because obviously don't think many people had them beating LSU in their second game of the season, and it was a phenomenal game. Yeah, you did. But let's also be fair. You were also picking them to go against the rest of your family, but your wife's side of the family, let's just say. That's right. But you still picked them, and you were right. So kudos to you for that. And you were eating crow with Kelly earlier. You can take your victory lap there.
That's right.
But just going back to the Jordan Travis having just a phenomenal season. He's even playing a little injured. He had the best game of his career against Boston College last week. His first 300-yard passing game, he was just phenomenal. And the way the offense has really stepped up in the running game with the multiple backs, this should be a fantastic game. And I have no idea who's going to win. And this is just going to be, like I said, we did not expect this to be that great of that exciting a game going into the preseason, but this is just a fantastic matchup, and I cannot wait for it.
I agree wholeheartedly. This is going to be a fun game to watch. Wake Forest is all that in a bag of chips, and we're going to find out whether the Seminoles are the same when they take on Wake Forest, because Wake Forest can certainly pick you apart. Let's go on to this next game, because this is it. I think the game that everybody has been waiting for, preseason at least, and as we've gotten into each week, it has become bigger and bigger. This game has been looming it's just like casting this shadow across the rest of the ACC. It's NC State taking on Clemson in Death Valley. This could be like one of those lifetime type of games.
Yeah, we even going back into the preseason, when we had our guests from each team, Sam Newman for Clemson and Stephen Muma for NC State, and we, got both their thoughts in this game, and I think they were all pretty much using this game is most likely going to decide the Atlantic Division. I say most likely because we still can't count Wake Forest out, especially if they end up beating Florida State and knocking them from the rank of the unbeaten. But this is again, this could be impacted by Hurricane Ian. So we don't know if this game is going to be played, how this game is going to be played, because if they're going to play it, in a rainstorm, that's really going to affect the way I think NC State can win this game. Because like I just said a moment ago, Clemson's not very good against the pass. That's probably the biggest strength of NC State's offense is Devin Leary. He's having a really good season. I think he has like 8 touchdowns and 2 picks so far. Their defense has been really, really good. It's been as advertised. I think they're one of the top. I think they're number 2, I want to say, in the ACC in defense, something like that. And how are they going to stop Will Shipley, who's been really starting to break out as the season's gone on for Clemson, and their running game is been good. And what about DJ Uyunglele? He had one of the best games of his career against Wake Forest. Is this, the start of him figuring things out, or was just a 1-game trend and NC State kind of brings him back down a little bit? I think this is a very intriguing game for that reason.
Well, nobody can say that playing at home in this particular case isn't an advantage, because it certainly is. And as you mentioned, Will, if it's raining, it doesn't have to be a major downpour, though it could be. This could really impact how this game plays out. I would hate to see the weather, extreme weather, be something that that had that much influence on this game. I would love to see these two teams go at it head to head and play in great weather and just battle it out to the end. I think it's going to be one of those types of games, no matter what. And we'll see who can come out of that with a win. Very important game, NC State and Clemson. And like I said, Wake Forest and FSU giving us a little look there. Will, I appreciate it. Subscribe to ACC Nation on your favorite podcast and streaming radio platform, and be sure to like and subscribe to ACC Nation on YouTube as well. We want to say thanks to our special guests, Kelly Quinlan of Jackets Online and Steve Infante of News Channel 9. Make sure that you follow both of them on Twitter for the latest sports news about Georgia Tech and Syracuse. Until next time, cheers.
Skål.